Thank you, good evening. What an amazing crowd, what an amazing space, and what an honor to talk to Emily Feng, who is really one of our great NPR correspondents and an inspiration for your work over the years inside China and more recently involuntarily outside China. What is your connection to China? When is the first time you went and how did your interest develop?
My parents are from China. They're from Zhejiang province. They emigrated here in the early 1980s. Like many immigrant families, they threw themselves into the American project, the American dream. But we would go back to China every 5-6 years or so to visit my relatives. All of my relatives, every single one, still lives in Zhejiang province in China. So I like to joke that my parents are incredibly local in the US. They've lived in one small town of about 5,000 people for the last almost 40 years. And in China, all of our family live in this one small city in southern China.
Wow.
So I grew up with that, and I would go visit my family, but I didn't really have any interest in the country until about halfway through university, when I realized that there were foreign correspondents who live in China and report on this country. And I thought what they did was really cool. I had been to Beijing once right before the 2008 Olympics with my family. I had never been to northern China before. Remember, my family's from Zhejiang province. Just felt maybe this is the place where I start my career. Interesting enough, though, I didn't think about moving to China initially when I was thinking about being a foreign correspondent. I really wanted to move to Myanmar, which is in the news again. It just can't catch a break. In my last semester of university, had decided to, this is the unsanitized version, skip a few weeks of school, go to Myanmar, and see what the reporting conditions were like, and it just didn't feel very stable and not very good for a freelancer, which is what I was at that time. So I moved to China after that, just kind of randomly.
Which I think is part of the story you have to tell, that years ago China would be the place that would be the more open one and the freer one and the place where you felt you would have some latitude to work. In this really beautifully written book, if you have not already picked up a copy, there's a passage early on where, I'm paraphrasing poorly, but you say that you began to feel Chinese as you spent more time in the country and understood it better. What was happening to you and what were you witnessing?
I had never gotten to live in the Chinese language, to use it as a language to become real friends with someone, to consume pop culture in Chinese. I'd spent my entire life in the US, and my parents spoke to me in Chinese, but to this day, even though my Mandarin has gotten much better, I respond in English because that's just the custom that we have. And so to suddenly discover that there was this huge, diverse world that was so much bigger than even the China my parents had left and told me about, that had gotten filtered through their memories, and that was changing at a scale that was so incredible, and where there were many languages spoken, actually, and there were many different types of people, thinking many, many different types of thoughts was really enormously exciting for me. And I realized that there was something very substantive there to China, and felt like this was a project I could dive into for a long time.
What's it like to be a reporter in an authoritarian country?
Broad question, but I mean, I see a number of former China reporters, at least one, in this room here. So
asking for a friend. Anyway,
and
go on.
You've reported in China very recently, last week, actually.
True,
so I want to ask about that. But there's still so much latitude in China. I mean, yes, it's becoming more strict. Yes, it's becoming more authoritarian, but as you know, it's not homogenous. Policies are announced, but they're implemented very differently on the ground. And for sure, it became more difficult to report. But even during the COVID pandemic, when different cities and municipalities were locking down every few weeks, there was still enormous space and flexibility to travel and to speak to people and spend time with them and hear their stories.
Does somebody follow you? Is there a car behind you? Are you surveilled? What's going on?
In Beijing, we didn't feel a lot of in-person surveillance, particularly the first couple of years that I lived there. This would have been 2015, 16, 17, 18, really.
Yeah.
And it was only until you went outside of the city and went to smaller places that oftentimes you'd pick up a tail. This became much more evident during the COVID pandemic, and I think part of that was the natural evolution of technological surveillance. It just got better with time very quickly. The other was that there were fewer foreign correspondents to follow, so they had more security resources and fewer targets in the media to follow.
Oh, it was an employment issue. You needed to keep people busy. So
I think employment, also KPIs. You've got more people, more KPIs. That means more. And the online surveillance also became much more prevalent. I mean, it used to be that you might have a few hours or even a day when you land in a smaller city or a city outside of Beijing before you'd pick up a tail. And it became, the moment you got off the plane or the moment you got off the train platform. When I booked the tickets before I even went, in one case.
You have to use encrypted communications, I suppose, and try to be as private as you can.
But many people don't have encrypted communications, and they're not allowed. There's these, apps like Signal or Telegram. They're not in the Chinese App Store if you've got only a Chinese mobile number and credit card to register your iPhone on. So you would have to resort to WeChat or calling them.
Oh, which is, you presume, the state can surveil whenever they want to surveil it, right?
I know they were.
Yeah. Did you ever, when using an encrypted app, let the editor of The Atlantic into the chat?
Not that I know of.
Okay, just checking. I think it's going to be a standard question that I ask everyone for quite some time. When I've been there, I haven't felt particularly surveilled. Sometimes people I've interviewed, the police come by afterward. I learn and ask questions. So clearly they learned what was going on. We know that standards are different for our colleagues who live there, who are Chinese. And I presume, not just in China, but in a lot of places, that my communications are private unless someone really wants them. It's really just a matter of the government's level of interest in me, whether my stuff is read or not. Is that what you would say it's about?
Probably. It was hard to tell sometimes what stories they cared about, what stories they didn't, what stories they'd follow up on afterwards. I think some of the stories that I got the most heat for in terms of just state media coverage or criticism of the stories afterwards were stories that I thought were about culture or pop culture, basically. So it was hard to gauge, and I think that's what makes people nervous sometimes about living and working in China.
Did you have a different level of scrutiny because of your Chinese background, which made you different from me as a visitor to China?
I don't know. As a journalist, I don't have concrete proof of that. I mean, I think I was treated differently after I left China and I was not able to go back, and after I moved to Taiwan, a lot of people said to me, well, of course, it's because you're ethnically Chinese, and this is obviously a reason why they disliked you. I think I pushed back against that because I still have such a hard time trying to wrap my mind around that. Yeah, it's undeniable. I came under a lot of online harassment, in-person harassment, and it was a tone of voice that was taken with me more and more in my meetings with Chinese officials.
A tone of voice that you were being disloyal? Is that the way that they saw you?
Disloyal, but also that they felt that they could convince me this was a better story to tell. The China story, the story of China, was one that was better to tell. And maybe this was a tactical mistake, but from the first day that I got to China and was working on a journalist visa and had these regular meetings with the foreign ministry, I had made it a point, starting 2016 or something, to always speak to them in Mandarin. I wanted to show them that I had made an effort to learn the language, to read and write it, which I only did as an adult, and that I was really, really serious and genuine about doing my work here in China and staying. And maybe that led them to think that I was Chinese in a way that I didn't identify with.
Now, I want people to know, if they don't already, this book is built around a number of character sketches of really remarkable figures. And one of them who's coming into my mind now, Emma, is a woman who goes away from China, lives in the United States, in Kentucky, I think, for a number of years. And you write that she in deciding to go back home to China, didn't quite realize how much the country had changed in her absence. What was changing at that time? This is in recent years in China.
So Emma is this woman who almost gets a green card, but she decides at this juncture that she actually really wants to spend her entire adult life caring for her family and being in China. She's Chinese, and she would describe herself as a little pink, a Home, someone who's extremely nationalistic and would defend China even when she was studying and living in the US. But her father, who had done very, very well for himself as a local entrepreneur, first as a truck driver, then a logistics entrepreneur, and then started to dabble in real estate and finance, he gets swept up in this massive anti-corruption drive that targets private entrepreneurs specifically, not Communist Party officials. And she moves back literally just a few months after this happens and finds herself basically a petitioner. Everyone else in her family gets arrested, and she has to be the one who spent the last 7+ years in the US to fight their case.
This is an incredible case. Her father and mother are arrested at one point, and you make it clear that it's not necessarily that they have offended the Communist Party or the state, but that they have offended an individual.
A police officer.
You use the word grudge or vendetta. What was going on there? And what did that say about the country?
So this police officer had tried to invest, basically, with Emma's father, and it had not gone well. It had ended in a lawsuit, and this police officer had never gotten his principal, or he'd gotten his principal back, but he was hoping to get more out of this lawsuit. And so when the anti-corruption drive happened, Emma thinks that this police officer who had this long-standing grudge against her father then reported him for being essentially a kind of gang member, Hei Shou Hui, and had this umbrella of influence.
Wait. An authority would falsely say someone is a gang member? I'm just trying to get my brain around the idea of that happening, but please continue. Please continue. Sorry, go on.
Steve, you're getting spicy.
Sorry, I'm here.
Because Emma's father had, dabbled in real estate. He dabbled in finance. He'd lent money out on essentially the shadow lending market as a private lender to many, many people who needed capital quickly. Some of those loans had gone bad. Sometimes Emma's father had to go and collect or find that principal in certain ways.
Yeah.
And so his influence, his business network, and this was in Inner Mongolia, so this is a fast-growing, but also, fast developing, but relatively unregulated, I would say, region in China, meant that it was very easy to paint the picture that he was essentially a loan shark and a gang member.
How did that story fit into the broader picture of what was going on in China? Wasn't the government waging anti-corruption campaigns? This sounds pretty corrupt.
So they first waged an anti-corruption campaign against party members, and then it turned to these private entrepreneurs, and then finally to law enforcement themselves. But the reason why I was really interested in Emma's story is that people like her father operated in this gray space, for sure. They're not heroes, but they thought they were responding to what the government wanted at the time, which was they wanted to build quickly, they wanted liquid capital, state banks couldn't fill that gap entirely, even after the 2008 recession. And so he stepped in to fund that, and he was awarded for that. Baotou, the city where they're from, started building all these big high-rises. He was lending to government officials sometimes. He was developing the city in his mind and filling in sometimes where the state was not fast enough. And now he felt he was being punished for that, and Emma felt that was incredibly unfair.
This brings to mind your book title and the phrase that the book title is based on. What is that historic story? Where's the title come from?
It comes from a phrase that Chairman Mao puts out to let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. This idea that after years of intellectual and political repression, all of a sudden Chairman Mao wanted to hear other ideas, even if they were dissenting. And some people did respond, and they started writing big character posters and talking about ideas that they had repressed for a while, and then, Chairman Mao changed his mind and imprisoned a lot of these people. But this particular phrase, let only red flowers bloom, was a paraphrase of an actual interview that I did with someone who ends up becoming one of the main characters in the titular chapter. In this context, religious freedom and intellectual expression, specifically in the publishing world. I was interviewing this guy in the back of a car, and when I heard that phrase, he said something to the effect of, the state only wants red flowers now. They will only let red flowers bloom. I had not been thinking about writing this book at the time, but that phrase just stuck with me. And when I sat down and I started writing this book, that sentence came to mind again. And I put that down as the working title of the book, intending one day to change it if I came up with a better one. But I never did.
Did she make the right choice? What do you think? Yeah. It's a beautiful title. That story says a lot to me, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about what's happened in China in the last decade, and maybe imagining, an accordion, like the space for people opens up a little bit and then the government closes it down again, and they tell people you're welcome and then you're less welcome. Is that what's happening? Are we in a closing period now? What's going on?
I think so, but that also means that the accordion, so to speak, is going to open again at some point. I think. You've observed these contractions and then expansions again over your years, because you've reported from China on and off for years and years now.
A little less than a decade, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating country that I know a tiny fragment about. But it is remarkable, as you say, how open it feels in spite of not being strictly open. And there's a lot to talk about there. One of them is just the reality that if you're able to tell me if you think this is true. If you show up in a country, even if you know nothing, even if you've been allowed to know nothing, even if it's a closed society, just getting to the airport and getting into town, you gain so much information from looking around and chatting with people. It's remarkable. It feels remarkable to me how hard it is to truly close a society. I haven't been to North Korea, maybe that's worse, but it's truly hard to close such a vast and vibrant society. You learn a lot, don't you?
Absolutely, and that's why I wanted to write the book, is that all these stories some of which made their way into NPR stories, I wanted to give more room to, and also to give people a feeling of the texture and rhythm as close as I could to recreate that experience of actually going yourself and realizing this is a huge country with real people who have feelings and dreams and livelihoods, and who might not necessarily be the Chinese people that get reported in news about tariffs, for example.
Yeah.
You know, we don't just have to interview the factory owner or the whatever, but just people who are living their ordinary
As
lives
I just
and
did,
what that
but
looks
she
like.
didn't mean to take a shot there at all. Go on.
No.
That's a kind
Well,
of
you didn't get a book. You didn't get an audiobook length version to do that, is what I mean.
Go on.
Maybe you should.
Maybe I should. We'll see. We'll see. Like, what is the information environment there? What information is available to the average person or to other people?
There's a ton of information. That's the other thing. Like, there's so much cultural production in China, in the Mandarin language, but of course it's also highly managed. And so one thing that really interests me is this contrast between an internet. If you go on social media, short video streaming apps, you go into streaming services and watch what new television shows are out there or what new musicians are there. There's a ton going on in China, but of course there are broad guidelines in which that space is happening, and for the most part, people don't often encounter censorship or overtly if you're kind of just going on for entertainment. But I wanted to profile someone in the book who thinks that they're solidly in safe space and then ventures just a little bit too far by accident.
Tell that story. Go for it.
So the person I decided would be best for telling the story is this guy who's actually best known for being a thief. And he gets caught repeatedly for stealing scooters, and he gives this jailhouse interview more than a decade ago at this point, where he says, I keep stealing scooters because I don't want to work another day in my life. I'd rather go to prison, and coming to prison is like coming home. So away he goes, and out he comes. He steals another scooter. He gets caught again, goes back to prison. In that period of time, he doesn't even have a smartphone. He definitely doesn't have internet inside prison. But in that time, he goes viral on the Chinese internet, and so he comes out an internet star, and he decides eventually to capitalize on that fame, thinking that he can make a bunch of money and finally never work again and be his own boss. But he can't shed this legacy of being a scooter thief behind him. And so although he tries to be a good person, he volunteers, he encourages young people to go to university, the internet censors on TikTok, Douyin, and other streaming platforms like Kuaishou and Bilibili and things, they just don't let him create an account. And eventually he has to find other ways to exist online and offline.
This is a little insight there as well. I mean, the censorship regime prevents negative information about the party, but it's also moralistic, isn't it? They're trying to be like guardians of people's
They're trying
morality.
to promote positive energy when needed, right? They can dial it up when they need more positive energy. Otherwise, just let people organically create their own content. But when needed, we can remove negative content and we can boost the positive energy.
Does the internet feel censored most of the time? Or do they have it so subtle that, for the most part, except when something mysteriously disappears, you don't even notice it?
I mean, I felt like I had so much choice when I was living in China. So no, it didn't feel like that at the time.
And then when you plug in a VPN and get access to, I don't know, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times,
yeah, and that's the
whatever it
other
is,
thing. There
what
were so
happens
many
then?
ways of getting over the Chinese firewall. People had their own homemade VPNs. There were WeChat accounts that would repost stories, knowing that they'd be taken down after a couple of days, but repost stories from the New York Times or even from NPR, so that you didn't have to go on the actual New York Times or NPR app itself.
Would you notice a difference between people who, did option A and option B, meaning censored internet or VPN? Would they seem to be a different person, have different views, be informed in different ways?
I lived in Beijing, so I felt like everyone was incredibly well educated and knew what was going on in geopolitics. It was not uncommon to get into a taxi and have a debate about NVIDIA and ASML.
In a taxi cab in Iran or in a private conversation in Iran, people will not only talk about anything, they will sometimes denounce the government. Doesn't mean they're necessarily ready for a revolution, but they will speak angrily about the government the way that people might do in public in the United States. Did that happen to you in Beijing? That people would cross red lines when they were just talking or just in a taxi or whatever?
I don't think that they were that open, but for sure people would express their opinions, especially old Beijingers who had seen a lot, had a lot of stories to tell. Would they go on the record, on microphone for that? No. But just chatting, yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask about Yang Bin, who is the first character in the book, who is a lawyer who does cross a lot of lines for a profession, ultimately. Who is she and what was her background?
She starts out as a state prosecutor, so she's working in the system at the provincial level, prosecute crime. And what I found exciting about her is she's helping construct this new legal system that's taking place as China is opening up to the rest of the world. So she's doing really important work and learning from Western sources on how to build that rule of law system. She's extremely idealistic, and she becomes quite famous actually for asking for a more lenient sentence, which was unusual at the time for a migrant worker, a migrant mother who out of desperation and poverty kills her own daughter. And this shocked the nation at the time because as China was opening up, there was also a resurgence in crime. And the zeitgeist was to prosecute that harshly. And she argued for the opposite. She had envisioned a very different type of legal system with very different, more humanistic aims for what it would ultimately achieve. And to her surprise, she got pushback, but to her surprise, in the appeal, she ends up winning a more lenient sentence for this mother, Zhou Moying, and becomes nationally famous for displaying mercy. But she also gets effectively demoted. I mean, on paper, promoted, but sent to a job where she doesn't get to see much action. And so she decides at this point, she's seen enough of being inside the system. She's going to become outside the system and become a human rights lawyer to join the other side, so to speak. And it's that transformation and that contrast that she's seen in her career that fascinated me.
So she became famous at this moment where the accordion was opening a little bit, but immediately got some blowback from inside the system, which I think everybody understands. You're standing up, you're getting too much attention, we don't like you anymore. But it was a moment of openness. And then she manages to become a human rights lawyer, a risky career change, just as the accordion seems to be closing a little bit. What was happening in 2015?
So this coincides with my timeline a little bit. I only know this looking back. I moved to China July 2015, and this was the week after something called the 705 crackdown. So on July 5th, hundreds of human rights lawyers were arrested around the country, and Yangbing was not directly affected, but in the years afterwards, the space to do this kind of constitutional reform, civil litigation shrunk dramatically. And a lot of the lawyers who were originally arrested were eventually disbarred. Some of them went on to serve prison sentences. And Yangbing eventually loses her license. And she has the opportunity to apply for a new one, but she can't find any law firm who will help her sponsor that. But she still persists, and she displays remarkable tenacity. And
what kinds of cases does she pursue?
One case that she was working on when I was interviewing her was a land seizure case in Yunnan province. Another was a poet in Tibet who had gotten arrested, and she was trying to at least get him family visitation rights. She was also not on the legal team, but involved with another case that we were following at the time for an entrepreneur. So this was part of the crackdown on private entrepreneurs who had been supportive of her career as a human rights lawyer.
I want to ask at some length, I suppose, what you think it takes to do that kind of work. When I was growing up as a kid, I would read stories about like being behind the Iron Curtain and so forth, and they just terrified me. Like, how do you do that when the government seems to be everywhere, when the government is making insistent demands and can kill you? How do you go ahead? How do you defy the government? How do you become the one protester or the one lawyer who says, this is the law and I insist on, or these are my rights, even if the law is not on my side, these are my rights and I insist on them. I've always been amazed by that, amazed by people who manage to do that, and am conscious that most people can't and won't. So what does it take?
She had seen the other side, so to speak. So she felt like she had seen a lot of this control on the other side and felt that she was prepared emotionally for it. She also is a Christian, and I think that gave her a lot of conviction in what she was doing. But she also was tired at a certain point. At one point, she was taking fewer cases. She was mostly living in her home near the ocean in southern China, was trying to take a break. And that's when someone named Su Zhiyong came to her asking for help. And so she takes him in. He at this point was a fugitive, and she shelters him.
Yeah, for quite some time before he was
several
arrested.
weeks, yeah.
I mean, I have so many questions. I suppose one of them is hard to answer directly, but we can speculate, or you can speculate. Why didn't the government just arrest her and jail her the way that it did so many other people that bothered the government?
I think she knows how to work inside the system. For the last couple of years, she hasn't had a law license, so she's actually not the official legal representative. In a lot of these cases, she's an outside advisor. And so it's very, very hard to punish her. You can't take away her license. It's already been taken away. She's not under the direct supervision of the Ministry of Justice anymore because she doesn't have a license. She's just there giving advice. There's an astonishing amount of latitude if you're willing to go through a lot to still continue to work and report in China. And I think that she exemplifies this so beautifully.
But it would be easy to presume they can just arrest her, they can just jail her forever, they can disappear her somewhere, they can kill her. Is it not quite true? Is there something that makes the state not want to do that? Does it damage their legitimacy if they do that?
There's still a lot of procedures, and I think this is where lawfare is used so effectively. You can throw a ton of bureaucracy at people and drown them in that and kill cases that way without having to kill a person, which is messy and gets a lot of attention. And I think that the Chinese state is incredibly good at heading off incidents because they can use lawfare, they can use these myriad systems of rules to stymie outright opposition before it even happens.
As you're talking, I'm thinking, oddly enough, of a Martin Scorsese movie that I think nobody saw about missionaries, Portuguese Christian missionaries who go to Japan. And
I watched the entire thing, but
you
I
know
had to split it up into two sessions. It was too long.
It's a very long movie. It's a very long movie. If anybody remembers the title, Silence. But the essence of the...
Filmed in Taiwan, by the way.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
The essence of the film is that these missionaries have showed up in Japan. They are definitely not welcome. It's the 1500s, I believe. And they are captured by the imperial government. And the government could put them to death, but they don't want to. They want the missionaries, they want to persuade the missionaries that the Japanese way is right. They want the missionaries to be on their side. And you realize at some point that gives the individual power. The government doesn't just want to crush you. The government wants you on its side, and you can withhold that consent. It gives power. Is that true in China, do you think?
I think that people do exhibit a remarkable resilience. And I wanted to capture that maybe their actions might be curtailed, they're not able to be the human rights lawyer and take on all the cases they wanted to, but they keep some measure of dignity in their own spaces for self-expression. And I think also, there's a huge difference between a government like the one we have in China versus the one we have in Russia, where I think you have some of the same areas of clampdown, but also spaces where people are able to express themselves or express some kind of dissent in both countries. But in Russia, you also have, people who fall out of windows, who are assassinated, who ingest nerve poison all of a sudden. And that doesn't happen in China. And I think that's because the government is much more sophisticated in how it tries to shape events the way that it wants to turn out. It doesn't need to imprison someone every time or kill them even, but you try to head off those incidents from happening in the first place.
What are some other risks that your characters take? What's a risk that someone takes that's on your mind that we haven't come to yet?
I profile a young Taiwanese student who, foolishly perhaps, decides to make a video denouncing Xi Jinping without realizing the risks, thinks Taiwan will give him asylum, and finds himself in the middle of this bigger conversation about where Taiwan sees itself, refugee policy, what is China even, what is the difference between the PRC and the ROC. I profile a young protester in Hong Kong named Kenny who decides to become a frontline protester despite the physical and legal risks and ends up getting caught and becomes a legal fugitive. And then as I was writing the book, all these stories started converging. So the people that I was meeting in Hong Kong would end up in Taiwan. The people I met in Taiwan were ending up in the US. The people that I was meeting in the US somehow were connected to stories that I reported on years earlier in China. And I also wanted to highlight that interconnectivity in the book. That this
Have any of the US people yet moved to Canada? Just curious. No, go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
One did move to Canada,
okay.
But not from the US, from
Okay,
Thailand.
Fine. Okay, fine.
But I also wanted to highlight the fact that this discussion about what is Chineseness, these issues of China's influence, they're not confined specifically to China or even Hong Kong or even Taiwan, but that they're global.
What lengths did you go to try to understand the Uyghur experience in China?
It started out by just going to the region, and then the story evolved. It became a data story because it was really hard to report physically from the region. Then it became a diaspora story. So we were going to Turkey, we were going to Kazakhstan, we were talking to people in Canada and the US and Europe for new information. Then those sources of information started drying up because even these family members living outside of China were not being able to talk to their family inside Xinjiang anymore. And it became very, very hard to continue the story, honestly. But the Xinjiang story is one that I think just started out purely out of curiosity because I loved traveling to the region and then ended up becoming this global story.
You ended up doing some of your coverage outside of China, if I remember correctly, isn't that right?
A lot of it from Turkey and Central Asia.
Mm-hmm. Where people had fled to and they had contacts that they could go back in. The argument is made, and there's certainly a lot of data, that whatever you think of human rights in China, that people's lives have vastly improved. That is undeniably true over a course of 30 years or 20 years. Do you think it's true if we looked over the last 5 years or 7 years?
Compared to how it was maybe during the last few months of the zero COVID policy, probably. But I do think that something that's probably changed that I would be curious to see and report on if I could go back to China as a journalist would be to understand what people's hopes and dreams are for the future. Are they as optimistic as they were 5-10 years ago when I first moved to China? I would guess not. And I think that some of the threads that I was reporting on that make their way into the book, the scooter thief who really becomes kind of a rebel symbol of the lying flat movement, basically just quitting the work hard, the work grind that people used to be used to in China, that's now become not just a fringe idea, but quite mainstream.
Would you explain the term lying flat for those who don't already know?
This idea of not working so hard, but instead just lying flat and resting.
Slackers. They're slackers. Okay. And when you say movement, I mean, first, the idea that you would lie flat as part of a movement seems contradictory, but are they organized in some way? Are they out there marching
lying
in
flat
line
together?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Well, I think
are they making a statement? I guess is a more realistic way to.
Started out as a bit of a joke. Obviously, someone like the scooter thief Zhou Liti, who unintentionally embodied this ideal of slacking, was seen as somehow subversive, which is why his videos ended up being taken down. The state does not want people to be unproductive. Another way in which I saw that happening was, I did a story, one of the last chapters that I wrote for this book was about gender and how people understand the female gender in China increasingly in terms of reproduction, again, and how that has tied into, and this is getting a little bit more academic than the way that I present it in the book, but that this is starting to get into these discussions about productivity again, but in kind of a state, neonatalist way of we must be productive in birthing children, new workers, basically, new citizens. And I think that that's gotten much more pushback at the same time, in direct correlation to the rhetoric we're seeing about having bigger families in China.
Someone told me about the statue in Wuhan, which is a statue of the Chinese family. You're familiar with this?
No.
Oh, okay. So, statue by the riverside in Wuhan from years and years ago, and it has a mother, a father, and a child. And then after a while, in recent years, they added a second child. And they've now added a third child. That's what I've been told. When I was last in the Wuhan riverfront, I think it was just one kid. But that symbolizes what the state wants. What have you thought about, as you have reported on and more recently perhaps read about the state's various efforts to encourage population growth and childbirth? Do they seem to match up with the needs and demands of Chinese families?
I think that it's hard to dictate how people want to plan their families, and that there's always pushback against that. I can see the economic argument for it, but I think that China needs to think of different, and the US as well, different models for economic policies that maybe are not so reliant on constant growth and constant consumption.
I want to ask how much you think technology has changed China and how much of the future we are able to see there. Obviously, we live in a highly technological society, but I feel like it hits me in the face in a different way when I go to a Chinese airport and see my own face on a screen, or I pay for things without ever taking out a card, like never paying in cash, that sort of thing. How much is that actually changing daily life in society and shaping the way that people live?
I think that it makes things more seamless. When I was living in China, I felt like ordering a taxi, getting groceries, buying something online and having it delivered was so much easier, faster, and more seamless than it was in the US. And it's partially because I think the mobile online ecosystem is so much better developed and there's a higher engagement with that. But that's in part only possible because of migrant workers. It's only possible when you have college graduates who are running the back end and working 996 hours, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, or people who can deliver those goods to you at 3 a.m. rather than waiting 2 days to deliver it to you. But that's still kind of that 24/7 pace. And I wonder if that's changed now, that maybe people are more willing to wait. There's not as much cheap labor anymore. We'll see that change.
I wonder how much automation is going to replace that human labor. I also think about, I never miss marveling at this thing that you see in China. It's a really unusual thing. It's hard to imagine in the United States. They have these trains, and you get on the train, and it actually leaves on time and arrives at the destination. It's really a remarkable thing. I find it's easier to get around China than it is to get around the United States, generally speaking.
That's what, despite all the controls and the censorship, China is a wonderful place to report because it's big, there's a lot of places to go, and it's really easy and cheap to get there because of the infrastructure. And it's also relatively physically safe, even for female reporters. And so I think that is a flip side to some of the more negative things that we talk about. It can be really, really hard to actually get a person to talk to you, but the stories are there, and logistically, it's incredibly easy to get around.
In spite of what you just said, I'm about to talk about the downside of being a reporter.
Okay.
You noted that it's in many ways easy to be a reporter. You note in the book that there was a period toward the end where you were having to answer questions all the time. What was that like, and what went through your mind? Where would somebody ask you questions? What would the questions be, and how scared, if at all, were you scared?
During the 2019 Hong Kong protests, it started at first when I was trying to come back into mainland China, that I would get caught up for about an hour, sometimes 3 hours at immigration. And they would ask the same routine questions, what I did for work, what I covered. And the questions every time the sessions would get longer and longer. And then it started happening when I was leaving mainland China too. So I almost missed so many flights to Hong Kong and also on vacations in 2019. But this was also when I started realizing there might be a time when I will have to report on China outside of China. And it's when I started seriously thinking about writing the book as a way to kind of keep up my connection to these stories and to this country. Luckily, unluckily, then the COVID pandemic started and I just didn't leave China for the next almost 3 years.
Until you did leave and they didn't let you back. I'm curious if in that latter part, if you were a little like that human rights lawyer. You were aware that something could happen and you were just prepared for it and went on and did your job.
Yeah, and I often think about, what could I have done differently? Could I have been more diplomatic? Partially maybe for my own sanity, I don't think so.
What do you mean by that?
Well, how do you change what you report on and how you report if that is the story and that's what you're naturally interested in? I don't have any evidence to say that if I hadn't done something, that I would still be in China today. I then moved to Taiwan and I lived there for the last 2 years before moving to DC about 2 months ago. That was difficult. It was sometimes incredibly slow. It was also really restorative, and it gave me the space to write this book, and it shaped the content and the flow of this book. So I don't know what I would have changed. I don't think anything.
So advice for writers: go off on an island for a couple of years and think. That's the advice you're giving us. Is that right?
While reporting full-time, Steve.
While reporting full-time for National Public Radio. Emily Feng, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Steve.
In the United States, especially in this town today, the story here about China is one-dimensional. It is a strategic competitor, and there's less interest perceivably from broader Americans about everyday Chinese lives, struggles, the dreams, whatsoever. So at this stage, when both countries are turning increasingly hostile towards each other, how can everyday Americans or journalists keep telling the story of the nuance of China?
Well, I think Steve is doing that, and maybe you want to talk about how you approached this last trip to China. You came
sure.
back just a few days ago.
Sure, thank you. I really appreciate that. I do have a kind of self-centered answer to that, or self-interested answer to that, which is support public media. Oh, thank you. You can applaud that. And I won't say that I do a good job, but I make an effort. At the very thing that you're talking about, when I travel anywhere in the world, and I've been to dozens of countries to report, I'm interested in the news, but also interested in people's lives and what they're like. What is it like to be there? What is it like to meet these people? What is it like to eat the food and smell the smells and hear the sounds and everything else? We had a story on last Friday, hard to believe that was only 1 week ago, from Yiwu, China. And it was this giant international market. I think you, among others, recommended that we go there. And it's a wholesale market. Thousands of factories in the region send their stuff to Yiwu, and it ultimately gets shipped to places around the world, including the United States, stuffies and hairpins and hardware and a million other things. And in thinking about that story, the news that I wanted to pursue and that we wove in was, how are you responding to American tariffs? But that's really kind of a simple, almost boring question. Well, I'm going to pay them. No, I'm not going to pay them. Maybe I'll pay a couple percentage points of them. And then it's like, what else is there? But what was truly interesting to me was being in this city and going for a run in the park in the morning and then going into this market that is the size of multiple mega malls and meeting these people who man these kind of storefront showrooms and finding out their lives. And these people were hustlers, and I don't mean that in a negative way. Like, everybody we met had a story of, I got started in life, I was living somewhere else, I tried something else, and then I got into this business, I was interested in this business, and now I'm selling hardware because my relatives have a factory and they make hardware, and we're selling it in the United States. And I don't want to talk exactly about money, but I'm clearly making millions of dollars. And and that's a story. And I don't know if you would have heard this story, but there was a guy, and I'm not sure that we know all of his tale. I think he withheld a little bit of it, but he's 33 years old. He was trying to make his fortune in crypto, and then he changed course a little more than a year ago. He bought a number of those commercially available 3D printers, the kind that you can buy in your home, and maybe some of you even have in your home. And he began printing toys. And he got to where he had 20 3D printers all over his apartment making plastic toys, and he was selling them. He found an outlet. He was selling them in different parts of the world, and so he bought more 3D printers, and it's just the kind of 3D printer you can buy on Amazon, and it's like the printers were replicating because he would make money and buy more printers. And
He was printing printers?
he was printing toys to make money, which then he would use to order more printers. Forgive me for that poetic license, but. By the time we got there, this guy who a little more than a year ago had like 0 printers and then 20 printers had established a factory, and there were 4,000 3D printers printing out crap. I mean, no, toys. Some of them was actually really fascinating, like little articulated toys that would move different ways, and they had human workers there to stick little eyes on the toys. And he's like, and this is the first 4,000. I'm opening another factory with 4,000 more. And it's like selling stuff all over the world. And he claimed not even to be taking any money out of the business. He's putting it all back in. He's putting it all back in. People were trying to make something of themselves. And there is a macro story there. You know, is China dumping plastic toys in American markets and driving there's a macro story there. And there's a story about tariffs and so forth. But there's also just a human story about human beings, and they are relatable. And sometimes when I'm in a place like that, I catch myself saying, wow, that's very American. And of course it's not. It's very human. It's human, and it's awesome.
A lot of journalists have made comparisons between aspects of what is happening in the U.S. and things that have happened elsewhere. And I'm just curious, kind of, if you could speak to that. I know it's sort of an open-ended question.
You know, I've done a piece asking other people who are far more experienced China watchers to compare their understanding of U.S. politics to their study of Chinese politics over the last 50 years, and they've noted what they would call our eerie echoes between the two. I think as journalists, I don't know how you feel having reported around the world and seen how reporting conditions are in other countries, but I think it does prepare you a little bit to know that things are far worse in other countries, and yet people persist. And I think that gives me some determination to do so here. You know, my boyfriend turned to me a few weeks ago and he goes, babe, we thrive under authoritarianism. And I think we're not there here. But I think that, you know, I expect the worst and prepare for the worst, but we're not there yet. But Steve, you've talked about this as well.
I have a couple of thoughts, and this might be a story that somebody here heard, but last week we interviewed a Chinese scholar named Da Wei, who studies the United States. And he said he had American friends who brought up the Cultural Revolution, that it felt like the Cultural Revolution to him. And I feel that Da Wei's answer was subtle and informative. He said, yes, there is something to the comparison. The attack on universities, the attack on intellectuals, the idea that the ordinary person and common sense is correct and sophisticated thought is suspicious and has to be eliminated. And also the idea that there is this populist revolution that is being directed by a charismatic figure on the top. That was his analysis. And so he said it had that smell. He used the word smells. But he also argued, he said it is 1 or 2% of the Cultural Revolution. And I want to be clear on that. We have an elected government, a legitimate government, that is doing things that a lot of its opponents would say are way beyond norms and in many cases way beyond the law. And judges, in fact, in multiple cases have found the administration has gone beyond the law. But it is still the United States, and there is still freedom of speech. There have always been, in a way, restrictions on free speech in this country. I think it was Mark Twain who said something to the effect of free speech is a right that you have until you try, as long as you're not fool enough to use it. There are consequences for free speech, and there always have been in the United States. But part of having rights is to have the experience of someone challenging your rights. And part of maintaining those rights is insisting upon them and insisting that you will do what you have a right to do and that you know there may well, from time to time, be consequences. That is part of the experience of living in America. that has always been part of the experience of living in this country, and it is what is necessary in this small d democratic moment for those who are not satisfied with what's going on. The answer to that is to insist upon your rights and to engage in that debate with people who are happy with what's going on right now, and there are many of those as well.
One question is about self-censorship. So to what extent the foreign journalists, especially those in China, feel they have to practice self-censorship?
The foreign correspondence community, or I shouldn't say community, the presence of foreign correspondents is incredibly diverse in China. I think maybe you're thinking of Western correspondents, but by far the biggest cohort of foreign correspondents in China remains the Japanese, the Koreans, and then probably the Russians and North Koreans. So, I don't know about self-censorship in those circles. I know that on press freedom issues, often the Japanese were extremely helpful because they covered China to such a minute degree. Many of them are lifelong China watchers. They learned to speak Chinese and read Chinese extremely well. Among the Western media, I didn't encounter examples of self-censorship. I think that you have correspondents who always have different interests, so maybe they come in wanting to do more lifestyle, more culture reporting. And I think the undeniable thing is there are just fewer foreign correspondents in general, and so you're tasked with a big story and basically no resources to cover it. And so you cover the bare minimum, which is the headlines. And the headlines often match up really, really well with the kinds of topics that China and the Foreign Ministry and the State Council also want you to cover. They're economic stories, they're about the trade war. You go to big political meetings like the 2 sessions, and every 5 years the Party Congress, and there isn't as much space to do the kind of in-depth human stories that require travel or investigation that I think really teach you more about the country. So I encountered often people having to make really tough choices about where to spend their time. Was that self-censorship? Not at all. Their motivation was not to cover up stories, but it was just they didn't have enough time to actually look at the stories that maybe you and I would think matter more beyond the everyday headlines. And they also didn't have time to do good enough of a job where they felt confident about presenting, an investigation or an enterprise story. That takes weeks, if not months sometimes, and it's becoming increasingly hard to pull yourself out of the news cycle to do that.
Like, we hear a lot in Western media about how we're on the verge of war between Taiwan and China. Could you kind of go into how people in China and also people in Taiwan kind of view each other?
It's so complicated. It's not one or the other, and I think I only got after living in Taiwan. People still have so many close relationships between the two countries, and I think that what people don't realize is Taiwan is a cultural powerhouse, and so especially in the 80s and 90s, so many of the movies and the songs that, and also the people behind the scenes just in the industry, movie producers, script writers, lyricists, they were Taiwanese and they were writing for a Chinese audience. Taiwan realized this was a huge source of soft power, and they leveraged that when they were a military dictatorship as well. But that means that there is a huge awareness, I think, of Taiwan in apolitical terms in China, and vice versa, because so many Taiwanese used to study in China, and still tens of thousands live and work there. That being said, I was struck when I moved to Taiwan finally, early 2023, that there were basically no Chinese people anymore in Taiwan. And people would ask me all the time, to the day that I left, "Are you from Beijing?" when they would hear my accent, which no one ever asked me in Beijing. I do not sound like a Beijinger whatsoever. But that's just where I had become a real person in Mandarin. And so they hadn't heard a Chinese accent in so long that I automatically read as foreign. And there used to be a ton of students who had come from China and tourists, and that still hasn't bounced back after the pandemic. So there's basically no contact at all between the two places. This is also why I think that Taiwan is actually not the best fit for reporting on China from outside of China, though it's a wonderful place to live. So there is an increasingly divide between the two places. I meet people here who are from China, from Taiwan. They're great friends outside of their respective countries. Yeah, it's really complicated. And there are still a lot of mixed marriages and mixed families too. So children who are born to families where one parent is from China, one is from Taiwan. And there are enough of them that there is a conversation all the time, whether it's from immigration policy or cultural or political in these times about what that means. So there isn't a set answer, other than I think that people don't have an automatic opinion about what a Chinese person or a Taiwanese person is like. And Taiwan society is also highly polarized. So I think that you're going to get a really different answer depending on who you ask in Taiwan. Some people loved the fact that I had lived and worked in China, and that made it really easy to interview them. And other people, if they heard an accent that they thought was from Beijing, were extremely hostile until I had to explain why I sounded the way I did. So there's a whole range of thought there.
When you were reporting in China, did you see things that made you question the value of globalization or the high age of globalization that we were in and that we've exited?
You're familiar with the way that China embraced the world in exactly the way that the government wanted to embrace, and embraced the parts of globalization that it felt like taking on and pushed back on the parts that it did not like. Now we have the United States effectively doing that. And one of the things that I have thought about a lot in recent years is that globalization is an economic system, but it is also a political problem and a political challenge. You need to be able to sell it in any given country, and you need to be able to sell it to a large majority of people, and that has always been hard. There is a Jan Morris trilogy on the British Empire that notes in the latter chapters as the empire is fading away that the British working man, Jan Morris writes, had never really been in favor of empire, had never really understood why they were sending troops overseas, never really wanted to pay for it, just saw it as a burden, didn't get the point, didn't understand what it was in it for them. The United States has not had that kind of empire, but it definitely is an empire with 1 million allies around the world and troops in different countries and so forth. And there has always been a percentage of our people who have wondered, what's in this for me? Why am I doing that? And particularly in recent years, this narrative of why are the jobs in my community going somewhere else and not being replaced. People may look at what they feel is the objective reality of economic numbers. Look how much richer we are than in the year 2000 even, or the year 1960. Look how much more powerful we are by many measures than in the past. Look how much more secure we are with all of the allies that we have. But those who favored that view of the world seem to have failed to make the case. And when I talk with my family in Indiana, they don't get it and don't get what it was in it for them. And it's not that they're necessarily opposed to it, but they want some adjustments. They want some changes. One of the striking things for me that I try to keep in my head right now is that many people in Washington think we have rung down the curtain on globalization, rung down the curtain on the American-led world order, ended our relationships with allies and lots of other things. But there are some of our fellow Americans who do not even perceive that and are not even sure it's gone that far, and what they want is an adjustment, and they think they're in the middle of an adjustment. I am holding my judgment open as to which of those points of view is true, but I am acutely aware that if the United States is to remain engaged with the world in any way, the United States needs to have 51% or more than 51% of the country who buy that. And the people who are on the losing end of that would still have to, on some level, accept it. Because right now, a lot of people just don't. And that's part of what's going on here. It's not just one man, it's a lot of people's frustrations being channeled through one man.
Okay, let's get another round of applause for our